Well, this is going to be a little bit different lesson today, but I felt compelled to do this because we hear a lot of lies, and we hear it all over the networks. And we hear the networks say everybody believes that way. Everybody thinks that way. Everybody hates Trump. Everybody hates America. And that's not true. And we know that. Number one, we've shown incredible amounts of patriotism emerging all over the country. Have you seen that? And secondly, I love the fact that people are coming here from all over the world and saying things like, this place is great. This is not what I expected from our press. They're lying to us. This is an amazing place, and particularly Buc-ee's. So how many of you have ever been to Buc-ee's? I've never been, but I'm going to go. That's for sure. What's that? You have to go once. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. So today I want to deal with a few topics. The lies people try to tell us to destroy America. That's what people are trying to do. They're trying to destroy America. And I am not going to be politically correct today. I hope you don't mind that. I think the lies have always been there, but they're becoming louder and louder and louder. And there are big voices who are saying these things, and they're not true. I'm going to show you just 3 of the things that people say, 3 of the lies. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about the discovery of North America, the continent. And then thirdly, I want to talk a little bit about the founding of America. So I hope you don't mind this, but we're going to have fun. Number 1, America is racist. Anybody who know that guy is on there? Thomas Sowell, okay? And that's true probably at one point in our history, but the 1964 Civil Rights Act took care of that. It prohibits discrimination. And Barack Obama is just one example of the fact that Black Americans have the same opportunities as white Americans. Does that make sense? And I love what Thomas Sowell said. Jack, can you read that?
Racism is not dead, but it is on life support, kept alive by politicians, race hustlers, and people who get a sense of superiority by denouncing others as racists.
And that's absolutely true. It's kept alive by race baiters, people who want the controversy, people who want to speak as if this world is coming to an end and Black people have to hide because everybody's out to get them. That's not the case at all. It's not even close to the case. Well, there are other lies as well. Our founders owned slaves and they were hypocrites. And what's interesting is that many did have slaves, and some were adamantly opposed to slaves. So many had slaves, many did not, and many, like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, they were outwardly opposed to slavery. And as a matter of fact, they preached among their brethren. And what's interesting about it is that Hamilton was a founding member of the New York Society that advocated against slavery. John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, signed a bill to end slavery. And Ben Franklin owned slaves early, but John Adams and other people talking to him made him think, and he was a logical thinker, that, yeah, this is wrong. So he freed his slaves and became head of a Pennsylvania Abolition Society. And as the founders grappled with this whole issue of liberty, many of them, most of them, freed their slaves, and the ones who didn't, it was because the slaves wanted to stay with them, so they cared for them. Now, let me give you an example, because we have this myth that Black people were always downtrodden and everybody ignored them. No one paid attention to them. They put them over in a corner and made them work, and that was it. This guy's name is Lemuel Haynes. Anybody ever heard of Lemuel Haynes? Nobody? Well, let me tell you about Lemuel. He was the first Black man ordained as a minister in the United States. Now, you don't hear this in the mainstream media, but he was the first Black minister ordained in the United States. And what's interesting about that is that he was a veteran Minuteman of the American Revolution. How about that? Black people fighting for our country? Absolutely. Thirdly, he led and ministered to 4 white congregational churches in New England, most of them in Connecticut. Really? I mean, the white people came to hear him preach? Absolutely, because he actually had renown as a brilliant theologian. Lemuel Haynes, write that name down. Research him. He's an incredible guy, but you don't hear about that in the mainstream media, do you? Well, let's look further. How about, and there's one more thing before I get into this visitors, let me go back to Lemuel. So our founders owned slaves and they were hypocrites. The third lie is America was not founded as a Christian nation. How many of you know that? How many of you heard that before? America was not founded as a Christian. I've heard Barack Obama say that. And essentially, it was because John Adams said something at Tripoli, and he said that America wasn't a Christian nation, meaning America wasn't a theocracy. But that didn't mean it wasn't a Christian nation, nor did it mean that it was founded on Christian principles. Let me share some information with you. Before we had a constitution, we had 13 colonies, right? Each of these colonies had a constitution, okay? Each of them had a constitution, and people argue that there's no mention of God in the Constitution. In the Declaration of Independence, it only has 4 mentions. Oh, only 4? It's not necessarily a long document. Anybody ever read the Declaration of Independence? It's a relatively short document, and there's 4 mentions of God, plus the whole concept of God is implied both in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. As a matter of fact, David Barton makes the case, and it's a very strong case and a good case, that 34% of the principles in the U.S. Constitution come directly from the Bible. Well, God isn't mentioned. That doesn't mean he's not there. And it doesn't mean he's not present. And it doesn't mean they didn't consider his word when they developed the Constitution. And as a matter of fact, there is no mention of God in the book of Esther. But does that mean he's not present? So essentially, you've got these myths flying around. And 13 of the 13 colonies required a declaration of faith to hold an office. And 9 of 13 required you to be Protestant. Only Maryland, which is primarily Catholic. Now, also, and this is really important, all of the original constitutions had, and I quote, "I profess the Lord Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior." Okay, America was not founded as a Christian nation. Also, 55 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Bible-believing, church-going Christians. And all God's people said. Now, if America wasn't Christian, why did they list on the Liberty Bell Leviticus 25:10? Jack, can you read that?
Consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each one of you is to return to his family property and each to his own clan.
Consecrate. Go ahead, say it again. Consecrate in the
50th year. And
how about consecrate in the 250th year? How about that? Go ahead, Jack, finish.
And proclaim liberty.
Proclaim what? Proclaim what? Okay.
Throughout the land to all its inhabitants.
Now that's on the Liberty Bell. Well, we're going to see more evidence of that a little bit later, but I want to continue with the discovery of North America because this is really fun. Yeah. Columbus didn't discover America. And neither did Leif Erikson, although he arrived here in 1000 AD. And they tried to establish a colony, but it didn't work and it failed, and they left because the natives were hostile to them. Okay? So what happened? Let's talk more about this. And by the way, the natives were here before Leif Erikson arrived and before Columbus arrived. In 1492, Columbus discovers North America. Okay? And that eventually became the United States, but he landed in the Bahamas on an island. And he named the island San Salvador. That means Holy Savior. Okay? Now, what's interesting about this is that he had to leave. When he was traveling around, once he landed and named San Salvador, he continued to explore. And he wound up in Haiti. And he crashed the boat. He didn't crash it. The captain crashed the boat on a sandbar. So they didn't have enough room for all of the people to come back. So he left a crew of 39 men behind, and they sailed back to Spain with the good news. They had found all kinds of spices. They had found gold. They had found silver. They had found all kinds of jewels. And so what happened was in 1493, he returned. And in 1493, he brought a bunch of people with him. As a matter of fact, there were 1,500 people that he brought and 17 ships, okay? Why do you think so many people were interested in coming to America? Well, the gold for one, and the silver, but also Columbus talked about it being a beautiful land of plenty, right? And there were colonists, there were investors. There's those capitalists again. Those investors are always around. There are colonists, there are investors, there are noblemen, there are friars and priests. Now realize that most of the world was Catholic at that time, okay? So the friars and priests came as missionaries, and they came to convert the natives. And there was cattle. They had sheep, they had cows, they had horses, and they brought seeds and grains and sugar. What was the intent here in doing all this? They were going to stay. They were going to establish a settlement there. Now, unfortunately, when they came back, they found all 39 of the men that he'd left behind dead. Well, the 39 men were dead because the natives killed them. But the 39 men, number one, had been arguing among themselves about their desire for the gold and who was going to get more. Okay? That sounds almost biblical. But secondly, they kidnapped the native women. And when they kidnapped the native women, they raped them. And the men didn't like that. And so they were history. They killed them. Okay? It's unfortunate, but you reap what you sow. Columbus, on the other hand, believed that the end was coming, that the Lord was coming back. So he felt that the trip needed to be an evangelistic trip. Okay? So he came as an evangelist. And what's really interesting, he was driven by Revelation 21:1. Can you read that, Jack?
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea.
So I saw a new heaven and a new earth. He was driven by that concept of a new heaven and new earth, and he wanted as many people as possible to be able to enjoy that, to be able to, with him, be saved and make it to heaven. Now, what kind of a messenger? What was he a messenger? A messenger of what? He was talking about the new heaven and new earth, and he believed the natives, but the ones he met on his first voyage needed to hear this message. He believed that. He was passionate about that, and they needed to hear the message of the gospel. About Jesus' life, Jesus' death, Jesus' resurrection. He was crucified for our sins. How many of you have ever told people about the gospel? How many people have ever told other folks about Jesus, and that he died for you, he cares for you, excuse me, and he rose for the dead for you? How many people have done that? We met a young man yesterday at marks, and he had tats all over him, up and down his arms and on his leg, because he had shorts on. He had them all over his legs too. So what do you think my assumption was? Huh? He probably what? I didn't think he knew Jesus. I didn't think he was interested in Jesus, right? How many of you would conclude the same thing? Okay. Well, as it turns out, where do you think he went to high school? Christian Academy. And and do you think he was a Christian? Yes, he was, but we talked to him about his Christianity and his faith, and he said he hadn't been in church in a while. He believed all that stuff, but he hadn't been in church in a while. So we encouraged him to go back to church. How many of you have ever had an encounter like that? You never know what happens when you just share a little bit. You know, well, are you involved in the church? Are you a Christian? What do you think about God? There are lots of different. What are some of the other questions you might ask?
Nancy and I were at the Overlook eating on a Saturday morning, and this two motorcycles and two ladies on the back, and they had tattoos and a big jacket, etc. Guy started walking toward me. I started getting a little nervous, and I thought this guy's gonna hit me up with some money or something like that. Here's what he said, and I made the judgment just like you did. Here's what he said: "We're just out this morning finding people we can pray for." I'll go, okay, man.
Well, I think you see this all over. You see it on TV. You see it with athletes. At Ohio State, a bunch of football players got saved and they started preaching in the common area, and there were thousands who came. Why? Because they were visible football players and heroes on campus, and they used their platform to tell people about Christ. That happened not only at Ohio State, it happened at Notre Dame, it happened at Auburn. It's happening all over the United States. And people are being driven by the desire to lead people to Christ. Yeah.
Put on our prayer request. Scarlet Hope has women all over the nation going to the World Cup to find the prostitutes that are there, or the girls that are looking to be, or whatever. Anyway, they are on the streets and they are online trying to find people all over at every World Cup venue. And they founded that ministry here, and we need to pray for
now. Did you hear what Teresa said? It's Scarlet Hope, okay? And it's Rochelle Starr who founded that. And
I have not heard it yet. I don't know, but anyway.
Well, I'll tell you how she got involved in this ministry. She saw a strip club, and she saw another strip club. And she was disgusted by that because she knew the women in there weren't living a quality life and they needed Jesus. And she didn't know what to do. She prayed about it, and God said, well, just go in and feed them. And so she started bringing meals into the women. She asked the owners, and they said, yeah, sure, fine, because he wanted them fed too. And what happens oftentimes is they rent, I don't know if you know this, but they rent that space inside a strip club. And when they rent that space, they have to pay that rent regularly. And if they don't make enough money as a stripper, they wind up getting into prostitution. And when they wind up getting into prostitution, to deal with that, they also wind up getting into drugs. And when they get into drugs, sometimes they don't know what they're doing and they get pregnant. Okay, and they have kids. And it's a big mess. And Rochelle knew that. So she went in there and started feeding them. And it was really interesting because her husband, Josh, would wait outside for her. And the police came by one day and wondered what this guy is doing out here in this car. And so he tried to explain that he was waiting for his wife, and they didn't believe him. He was getting ready to go to jail and for stalking, and he had to call his wife. His wife came out and explained, so they were fine. But from that, Teresa, how big are they? Do you know?
Yeah, Las Vegas, Miami.
Miami.
Oh, I don't know if it's Cincinnati, I think.
Yeah.
I can't name all the cities, but they have groups of women in all those cities and more that meet and take food to their clubs in their cities. And then they the girls, when they become interested, they tell them about Jesus every time. They're called the church ladies in a lot of the clubs. And
Yeah.
it's an amazing ministry.
Rochelle tells a story of going in one time and praying for a lady who was half on drugs and half drunk, and she threw up all over her, and she just stayed with her. Jerry, I know you've made meals for, yeah. How many women in here have made meals for Scarlet Hope?
Joy from home.
Yeah, that's right. That's
And that was really an inward way to minister, because the ladies would take the food and then get talked to the scripture.
well, about 10 years ago, maybe longer, we had Calvin go to Scarlet Hope and give his testimony. Any of you know Calvin? You know Calvin? Okay. Calvin had a horrendous upbringing. And at a very young age, he was raped as well. So he went in and told his story. And you should have seen the women coming up to him wanting to talk to him. And I'll tell you, right from its beginning, Rochelle told me that they had 300 people that they pulled out of that mess. And there are a lot more today. But that's one quiet ministry. You know, our church doesn't talk about Scarlet Hope, but that's an incredible ministry, an incredible ministry. And we need to pray for them. We need to support them. We need to encourage them. But I digress. But that's a good digression, Teresa.
The food trucks go to the strip clubs. And so the girls would rather buy from the food truck than didn't get homemade food. So we don't do it as much as.
Well, I'm sure Rochelle is creative. How many people have ever heard Rochelle speak? She's an incredible speaker.
When the online has exploded and they're able, I mean, I don't understand, how they find them, how the girls find them, but they do, and it's exploding all over. My gosh.
Well, back to the lesson, because we could talk about this all day. But Columbus prayed daily. He took communion daily. He fasted regularly, all because he was inspired to be an evangelist. And he believed some of the prophecies were intended specifically for him. Jack, can you read real quickly Isaiah 42:4 and Isaiah 49:1?
42:4, and I selected these from the King James Version. He shall not fail nor be discouraged till he have set judgment in the earth, and the isles shall wait for his law. And then 49:1, listen, O isles, unto me, and hearken, ye people from far. The Lord hath called me from the womb, from the bowels of my mother hath he made mention of my name.
See, he believed those prophecies, and so much so that Columbus required his crew of 90 men to attend Mass. They went to confession, and they received communion before they left. Now, he believed and often recited Psalm 97:1. Jack, can you read that?
The Lord reigns, let the earth be glad, let the distant shores rejoice.
Now, this is one of the many quotes of Columbus. Can you read that, Jack?
I prayed to the most wonderful Lord about my heart's great desire, and he gave me the spirit and the intelligence for the task. My hope is in the one who created us all, sustains me. He is an ever-present help in trouble.
Now, people ask, what about, okay, that's the United States, or that's going to be the United States. What about Canada? Well, there was a guy named John Cabot who helped settle Canada. And John Cabot did that in 1497. And the king gave him explicit orders to plant a Christian cross when he landed. And in 1498, in his voyage, his second voyage, he included friars as well. And they were missionaries. And actually, he was not English. He was Italian. And his name was Giovanni Capito. Giovanni Capito. Huh? I like that. It sounds like he's from my neighborhood. But he was part of the esteemed Scuola Grande di San Giovanni Evangelista. And what that means is, and what that stands for, is the great school of St. John the Evangelist. I think that speaks to the founding of Canada, the people who were there. The great school of St. John the Evangelist. And Jacques Cartier has a similar story to John Cabot's or Giovanni's. And essentially, you remember, and still today, the French helped settle Canada along with the English. And there was a treaty that brought them together. Now, what's interesting is in 1530, you've got Ponce de Leon. How many remember that from grade school? Ponce de Leon, okay? And he came in 1513, but in 1493, in this Columbus's second voyage, he was with Columbus. And he saw this country. And eventually he discovered Florida. And he named Florida, La Florida, because it had a lush landscape. And today it's called St. Augustine. Anybody ever been to St. Augustine? Do you see anything unusual about St. Augustine? They probably don't have a lush landscape anymore. There's too many houses. But effectively, that's what he saw. And after his discovery, he claimed Florida for Spain, at least initially. But we figured out how to get it back. Then I think this is interesting. In 1607, I'm going to fast forward, settlers landed, and shortly thereafter, they planted a cross at Jamestown. Okay? And this is Reverend Robert Hunt. And Reverend Robert Hunt held the first Anglican, now remember in England, they were mostly Anglican, and he held the first Anglican communion service there. Now, a little history about the Anglican church, okay? How did the King of England also become the head of the Anglican church? Go ahead, Don.
He was marrying women and
The king.
yeah, the king and
What was his name? Which one was it? King?
King Henry.
Henry the what?
Hey,
King Henry VIII.
and
You remember that song, I'm Henry VIII, I am?
and the Catholic Church wouldn't allow him to get divorced, so they broke off and started the Anglican Church.
Started his own church.
Yeah.
And he, of course, was the head. So Prince Charles, or King Charles now today, is also the head of the Anglican Church. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that prior to leaving in 1620, there were also 102 settlers. And they signed, before they left, the men signed the Mayflower Compact. Sorry, women. They didn't carry any weight back in 1620. Jack, can you read that?
Having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith in honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic.
Now, I pulled this out of the Mayflower Compact, but it's longer. But essentially, you get an idea of the spirit of these people when they were coming to America. Yeah, Karen.
The sad thing about this, Tony and I, when our kids were living in Boston, visited Plymouth Rock and the museum, looking specifically for this. Because we thought it should be right there at the front as you walk in. It's very end, it's something very small.
Yeah.
It's totally ignored.
Which is terrible.
Yes, it is.
I mean, that's an essential document. As a matter of fact, that was their first governing document. And it's an essential document in the history of our country as well. And really, they didn't set out for Cape Cod. They set out to land in Virginia. But the bad storms and wind blew them north, and they landed finally in Cape Cod and eventually settled in Plymouth. But they wanted to build this community here. It was a Christian community. And it was a Christian community where they could freely practice their separatist Protestant faith. Now, why was that an issue for them? They could freely practice their faith. Why not?
they were persecuted for that. They didn't want the Bible translated so the common man could read it. In fact, I think it was Tyndale who translated, he was martyred for that. And so they wanted to be able to follow God freely.
Yeah, absolutely. And they couldn't do that, particularly under the King of England, because the King of England saw that as a threat to his power and his authority, because they weren't coming under his authority as the head of the Anglican Church. So essentially, and they came here, by the way, with also an evangelistic zeal. They wanted to minister to the natives. So next we have the founding of the United States of America. Now, what's interesting here is that in 1619, the House of Burgesses was formed. And one of the things that they were was the first elected legislative body. It was also called the General Assembly of Virginia. And when we were there, and still today, it's called the General Assembly of Virginia. Okay? So, and that's by the way, that's the oldest General Assembly in the United States. But they had a royal charter, and the royal charter governed the House of Burgesses. And it was also called, as I said, the Virginia General Assembly. But Christian themes are embedded all through that. And John Porey said, and I quote, "Man's affairs do little prosper where God's service is neglected." Now that's right in there. That's right in there, and it's a theme. And the character and the charter also required mandatory church attendance. Now, can you imagine this in your state charter? And they had to also support the clergy. So all of those things are in the charter when they established that colony. And then between 1607 and 1673, American settlements were left to their own local government. Okay? And then George Whitefield came, and he arrived, and he sparked revival. And there was talk of freedom in Christ. John 8:36, Jack.
So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed.
If the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Now, as he's preaching all over America, he is not concerned about the status of people, the position of people, the wealth of people. He believes absolutely, and God's word says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So he believed that everybody, it was not God's will for any to perish, but all to come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And so Whitefield preached all over the place. How many people saw The Great Awakening? If you haven't seen that, I would encourage you to see that. It's a great movie. What did you take away from that movie? Yeah, Karen.
God was preparing our country to write and to have the founding fathers and to create our documents. He was converting many people to Christ, and I think that was part of his purpose, that we would be who we are.
And when he spoke with power. And God somehow elevated his voice. When he was in Philadelphia, he preached to, there were only 20,000 people who lived in Philadelphia. When he preached to 30,000 people, and they all heard him. Now, is that not a miracle? My goodness gracious. What's that?
Benjamin Franklin saw it as a miracle.
Well, I absolutely believe that Franklin got saved, but that's another story. Yeah, Bobby.
Well, at the end, that's what I was saying. I mean, Ben Franklin encouraged Congress to start praying before each time they met. And that kind of told me to a lot of people said that they thought Franklin was not a believer, but I think by the end of that movie, that was based on a lot of truth.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that Whitfield didn't want to be a preacher. He wanted to be an actor.
Well, he did want to be an actor, but can you see God moving? You know, he became an actor simply to develop the ability to project his voice and to project it with some passion, with some emotion. Because if you saw the movie, you saw the old English Anglican priests who didn't want him to be there. And as a matter of fact, stopped them in the middle and he said, okay, I'll go outside. And everybody followed him. And they heard the gospel, probably for the first time. He said, what did he say about truth? He said, in the theater, we speak of fiction, and we make it real and true so people are awake and alive and absorb it. He said, you have the truth and you speak it and it puts people to sleep. And so essentially that was what the Anglican Church was like. But now consider, at the same time, Great Britain was the most powerful nation in the world, bar none. So it was pretty bold for America to do what they did. It took immense courage. So I want to take a look at a timeline here because the timelines are important. If you take a look at this timeline, before we got to the timeline, the king began to impose taxes. The king needed to cover his war deficit of 140 million. Now, 140 million back then was real money, okay? And it was from the French and Indian War. So the taxes began. And they began in 1764 with the Sugar Act. And anything, I guess, like molasses, coffee, pimento, any of that stuff was taxed. And also the Currency Act said that when you pay for things, you have to pay for things with hard currency, like gold and silver. Paper currency didn't work. It wasn't going to work. Then in 1765, we had the Stamp Act, and that required a government stamp on any kind of official document. But then it grew to not only official document, it could be on playing cards, okay? And then the Quarantine Act, which, think about this. They had the responsibility of housing and feeding British soldiers who were stationed there. Now, can you imagine having to bring British soldiers in? Now, British soldiers weren't necessarily proper Englishmen. They were grunts and they were rough. And can you imagine inviting those folks into your home? You've got a peaceful home and you have to put them up and put up with them. And then in 1766, we have what I call the Declaratory Act. And they asserted absolute supremacy of Parliament to make laws and to issue taxes for the colonies in all cases whenever they wanted. Okay, can you imagine that? I don't care what you say. If I decide I want to put a tax out, if I want to impose a tax, I'm going to do it, and you can't say anything about it. And what was the cry of the colonists? Taxation without representation. And then in 1767, we have the Townshend Act. Those are revenue acts. And that was initiated on direct import duties on essential goods. And then essentially, you've also got 1773, the Tea Act. Well, we know about the Tea Act and what it did, and it was there to bail out the British East India Company. And so that began the protests. And we had, as a result of this, what did we have? The Boston Tea Party, right? And so Britain was upset by that, and they imposed another tax. So I want to go through a little bit of a timeline, because in 1774, they had what's called the coercive tax, which was really to the colonists intolerable. It was punishment for the Boston Tea Party. And they no longer had self-rule. They closed the ports of Boston. And really, they invaded people's homes increasingly. So there's a timeline here. I'm going to go through it real quickly. Jack, can you go through that for us?
April 19th, 1775, first shots fired in battles of Lexington and Concord. The Revolutionary War had begun.
Now, how many people have heard about the battles of Lexington and Concord? These are all important points in our history. Go ahead, Jack.
January 10th, 1776, Common Sense, published by Thomas Paine, and separation from Great Britain is clear.
Anybody ever read Common Sense? Yeah, I have. If you haven't read it, you'll enjoy it. Go ahead.
July 4th, 1776. Second Continental Congress adopts Jefferson's Declaration of Independence.
Okay, now we're getting serious here, aren't we? Because in the Declaration of Independence, what was America saying to Great Britain? Declaration of Independence. What are they saying? We're independent. We are no longer under your rule. Okay, now that didn't make Great Britain happy, did it? Go ahead, Jack.
March 2nd, 1781, Articles of Confederation adopted. October 19th, 1781, Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown, ending the Revolutionary War fighting. September 3rd, 1783, Treaty of Paris is signed officially, ending the Revolutionary War. September 17th, 1787, U.S. Constitution signed in Philadelphia replaces Articles of Confederation. And April 30th, 1789, George Washington is inaugurated as President of the United States.
Now, I missed some other steps in here because there were a lot more after July 4th, 1776. There were lots of wars. And of course, we've got the famous Valley Forge. But essentially, America won that war, which was unbelievable. We were a bunch of farmers, basically. That's what everybody did for the most part. And essentially, they beat probably the greatest, and at the time, by far, the greatest and most powerful nation in the world. What do you think? What do you think happened there? Was America just a good tactician? You think God's hand was involved in this? Yeah, but America is not a Christian nation, right?
It came out of that too with shots all through his cloak and everything else. And they were swearing that God protected him throughout the war.
Absolutely. So we're going to take a look at some of the characters of the revolution. And Jack, you can help me out here a little bit. First, we got George Washington. Now, George Washington had regular private prayer in his life. And it was on his knees because his nephew saw him, and he saw him doing private devotions with an open Bible while he kneeled. And he did it both in the morning and in the evening. Now, that was a British call to prayer in the morning and the evening. So he brought that over to America with him. Jack, can you read what he said?
Whereas it becomes us humbly to approach the throne of Almighty God with gratitude and praise for the wonders which his goodness has wrought in conducting our forefathers to this Western world, and above all, that he hath diffused the glorious light of the gospel, whereby, through the merits of our gracious Redeemer, we may become the heirs of his eternal glory.
America wasn't founded as a Christian nation, right?
In New York, it was just elected to run for Congress, said that's what she's going to destroy is the Western nation.
That's right.
Absolutely. So essentially, George here is praying on his knees for our country. And now you got the Frenchman, Marquis de Lafayette. How many have ever heard of that name? Okay. Or as they say in Lexington, what do they say in Lexington? Lafayette. Lafayette. And instead of saying Versailles, they say what? Sales, yes. But essentially, Marquis de Lafayette, he was a wealthy French aristocrat. How many of you ever seen the movie The Patriot? And who is Marquis de Lafayette, the rich, wealthy French aristocrat? Is he in there at all? He's all through it. He's got the blue outfit on. If you see it again, that's Marquis de Lafayette. And he was a major general who provided real important tactical skills and secured French reinforcements. At the end of the movie, you'll see, what do you see at the end of the movie? The French are finally arriving. And they're coming to America. And he was Catholic, he was fanatical about liberty, and he was quiet about his faith, but he was sincere about his faith.
The king said that, the King of France said to President Trump at his speech over there, Trump was bloviating about all his greatness, and the French guy says, "Yeah, but we saved you at the end."
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. Probably the first and last time they did anything like that, but they came to our aid. Let's take a look at General Nathaniel Greene. Now, this is an interesting guy. Okay, he was a gifted tactician of Washington's, and he wore down General Cornwallis in battles in the South, and he was a Quaker. And what's interesting, and a devout Christian, of course. Anybody ever met any Quakers and seen any Quakers? Or they've got a unique way of worship. They sit together in quiet, and as the Spirit moves, they'll share something. And what's interesting about it is our family, Gigi's family, were part Quakers, and so when people die, they have a memorial service where they sit around and share about the person who has passed. It's really a great thing. But anyway, they used to actually believe in God. What? Good. I'm sorry?
President Nixon.
Yeah, I believe so. That's at least what it was said. And Quakers had several schools, a University of Pennsylvania for one, Guilford College, another one, Haverford is another one. So he had lots of schools in the United States too. But he was kicked out of the Quakers. Why?
They're pacifists, aren't they?
Yeah, they're pacifists, and he embraced war. Gigi's uncle was a colonel, pretty high up in the American forces in the Second World War. He retired, and they called him back during the war, and he was an expert in breaking code and understanding tactics, and he also was a Quaker. So yeah.
Nixon,
Yeah, that's what they just said. So, but that's all right, Don. I can't hear anything either. Jack, can you read what Green said?
The injury done my country and the chains of slavery forging for posterity calls me forth to defend our common rights and repel the bold invaders of the sons of freedom. The cause is the cause of God and man. I am determined to defend my rights and maintain my freedom or sell my life in the attempt. And I hope the righteous God that rules the world will bless the armies of America and receive the spirits of those whose lot it is to fall in action into the paradise of God. With truest regard, your loving husband.
Now, these are leaders of our country, founders of our country. And to say that America was never a Christian nation is to decry and defame what they did and what they stood for. Now let's take a look at Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't necessarily a Christian, he was a deist. Okay, but he was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. And that Declaration of Independence justified our rebellion. And as I said, he was a deist who believed in a creator who was just and good and owed praise, but he didn't believe in the Trinity, and he didn't believe in the deity of Christ. That's a big one. And he said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And among those rights are what? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in the last line of the Declaration, Jefferson put, we appeal to the supreme judge of the universe. And who's that? Yeah, and in Revelation, it tells us that God is the supreme king, the supreme ruler, supreme judge of the universe. Now let's take a look at one of my favorite guys, Ben Franklin. Okay? Obviously, he was American ambassador to France. He was also a scientist. He was also a printer. He did all kinds of things. But he secured vital military and financial, and I think created a naval alliance with King Louis the 14th. Or no, King Louis the 16th, I'm sorry. He repeatedly quoted this verse, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. And without God's aid, he contended that the founding fathers would, Jack, read that.
Without God's aid, he contended, the founding fathers would succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel.
The builders of Babel. Of Babel is missing, but you get the point, right? Let's take a look at John Adams. And this is kind of interesting because he was a fierce advocate of independence and the chief negotiator of the Treaty of Paris that ended the war. He was also an opponent, a strong and vocal opponent of slavery. And he famously said, our Constitution was made for a moral people and a religious people, and it is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. John Adams said America was not founded as a Christian nation. And he said this. Come on. And he also said, Jack, go ahead.
We recognize no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus.
No king but Jesus. Yeah, Tom.
I find it interesting, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on the 50th anniversary of July 4th, 1826.
Well, and that's true. And he also knew the truth of what it said in Revelation 17:14.
They will make war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will overcome them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers.
That's why he said, we recognize no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus. Of course, Elvis said that too, didn't he? Elvis said, didn't you? How many people know that Elvis said that? They kept calling him the king, the king, the king. And what did he say?
No king but Jesus.
There's no king. That was Elvis. So I'm sure he's up in heaven too. But then we have some other leaders. I just want to go through them very quickly. Samuel Adams. He founded the Sons of Liberty. And did anybody ever see that movie, Sons of Liberty? It was on a long time. It was a Disney movie. It was really great. I loved it. With Johnny Tremaine. Anyway, he was the one who orchestrated the Boston Tea Party. And he signed the Declaration of Independence. Alexander Hamilton. He was the first Treasury Secretary and author of the majority of the Federalist Papers. James Madison, father of the Constitution, author of the Bill of Rights, and fourth U.S. president. John Jay, president of the Continental Congress, and the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. These guys all believed in God. These guys all served our country. And all of these guys led us. And all of them signed the Declaration of Independence, with which they ended with this. We pledge our life. Our what? Our life, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. We pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honors. They were willing to give their life. They were willing to give their fortune. They were willing even to give their sacred honor to advance the cause of liberty in the United States. You like that?
End up being hung and executed.
Some of them did. As a matter of fact, the guy who had been the head of the forerunner of Princeton was searched and hunted down and captured finally. And he was absolutely broke and devastated. So it happened to a lot of the founders that they were hunted because they were the brains behind it, and England knew that. So all of this is important to say that Mr. President said, you're going to have the best 4th of July ever. It's fantastic. No one will ever have seen anything like this. Okay? And don't worry, I'll get the money back soon. I made them an offer they couldn't refuse. I think essentially when you look at this, and God, I think God has a covenant with America. Do you believe that?
Yes.
And it's not that America has always been his favored nation, simply because we're a nation of sin. But essentially, our nation of sin is being brought back. And there are revivals going on all over the place. I started the class with that concept of there is revival going on. How many of you, I've seen that. How many of you have seen it? Jason Reynolds, he's a wild man. He's all over the map, but he leads people to Christ all over the place, not only here in Louisville, but all over the world. And he's getting married to a young evangelist who has her doctorate as a nursing practitioner, and she served in that capacity, but she said, you know what? God is calling me. And God called her first to New York and then to Nashville, and now he's calling her to Louisville. And she is ministering to thousands of people all over the world. There is revival moving. Tony, you had a question, comment.
Yeah, Eric and I are, by God's grace, involved with people in prison or out of prison. And there's a group called God Behind Bars.
Look it up.
Look it up online. You will see hundreds and thousands of prisoners raising their hands to Jesus. There is a revival going on in the prisons.
There's revival going on every place. And God has the capacity to move people. Only thing we have to do as his servants is share what he's told us. Share what he's done with us. No one can argue with you when you share your testimony. I sat down with a guy and shared my testimony with him. He got mad at me. And I said, why are you getting mad at me? I just listened to you talk to me for a half hour about your background. I'm telling you mine, and you're angry. And he couldn't figure it out. He said to me, you know what? I haven't thought about that. Essentially, the gospel is offensive to people who hear it, to people who want to resist it. But that's not your responsibility. When they resist you, just be strong. Share your testimony and then walk away. It's not up to you to save them, is it? It's up to the Holy Spirit. And we live in a country, fortunately, where we have the ability to share the gospel, to talk about the gospel. As much as Barack Obama and everybody else who has said differently, not only is this a Christian nation, not only was this founded as a Christian nation, but this is a nation of Christians still. And essentially, we have a lot of doctrinal differences, whether they're Methodist, whether they're Presbyterian, whether they're evangelical, whether they're Catholic. There are Christians who love God, want to serve God, and want to share his message with others. We need to be among them. We need to be aggressive. We need to have our hands, all of our hands go up when I ask you, how many of you have ever sat down with somebody and shared the gospel? I want us all to be aggressive at that. I want us all to be active at that. However way you do it. And there are an infinite number of ways to achieve that. So, how many believe that America was founded as a Christian nation? I do. So when people tell you that, and I have to tell you, I had fun doing this, but I had far more material that I could use. We'd be here for another hour and a half, 2 hours, because there is so much. But I would encourage you to study yourself. I would encourage you to read, to find out just exactly how our country was founded, the price people paid, and how much people love this country. I had a father-in-law who went to war, and some of you had father-in-law. My father-in-law was in prison camp in Japan for 3.5 years, and they starved him, and they beat him. And he smarted off to them anyway, and they beat him again. But he came home, and he survived. And you know, those veterans of World War II forged our country, and we enjoy the benefits of their work. Tony, I had the privilege of meeting your father, meeting your brother-in-law. These are heroes, okay? And all of you have heroes too. So it's important for us to understand we live in the freest country in the world. If you don't believe it, ask some of the foreigners who are coming here. I've asked Alvin to close us in prayer, and then I've asked him to lead us in God Bless America. What?
Well, President Trump has an office of faith in the White House, And if you look this up from Friday, he had them come and present to him their recommendations, and he spoke to the Faith and Freedom Convention. And they're getting rid of the Johnson Amendment, which says that pastors can't speak from the pulpit about political things. And they're also getting rid of the the idea of the separation of church and state. They've made a big statement that this was a one sentence in a letter from Thomas Jefferson, has nothing to do with our Constitution. They're requiring schools and organizations and businesses to write information for people to know their rights, and that the rights are to be able to speak there. So they have Christian rights, and it has nothing to do with the separation of church and state.
And that letter, by the way, from Thomas Jefferson was to the Danbury Baptists. And a fellow in the Danbury Baptist pastor was worried that they were going to have to worship the way they did in Great Britain. And Thomas Jefferson was assuring him that there would be separation of the government from their faith, and the government wouldn't impose their faith on him. And essentially, they weren't going to require a specific religion. And God, in fact, raised up a bunch of leaders who would support that. The problem was they have reinterpreted that as not protection from government, but protection of government from faith. And that wasn't the original intention at all.